today I decided to talk not really about some of the things that I have worked for many years, but more of the new stuff that I've been actually focusing on. And that is some of the what we call deep manifold sampler. And this is the denoising autoencoder that we use in order to do antibody design at Genentech at the moment. Anyway, so let me introduce you what this precision design is. So I've been actually working together with Professor Rich Bono, who is at New York University as well as at Flatiron. So he's a professor of biology, computer science, and data science. And with his postdoc back then, Vlad Grigorievich, who used to be a senior research scientist at Flatiron Institute in New York on protein modeling. Been working on that for about 3 to 4 years by, let's say, January 2021. And then we thought we had a bit, couple of the new exciting stuffs. And whenever you find something exciting in universities, you got to do one of two things. One is to write a grant proposal, hoping that the grant is going to be funded, so that you can actually continue working on the exciting stuff. And two, as Lunit has shown, is that you can just start a company and then go talk to VCs for money instead. And one thing we know, because Rich had been a professor for like about 15 years, and I was by then about 6 or into my 7th year as a professor. And one thing we started to hate a lot is to write another grant proposal. It really sucks. And then the funding rate has dropped all the way down to about 10% in US these days, so not really an option. So we decided to create a company called Precision Design. And we hired some of our first employees, Andy Watkins, who was back then a postdoc at Stanford working on modeling the RNA structures. And then Berenberg, our machine learning engineer, and Stephen Rao, who used to be the head of the machine learning at Pfizer. So we kind of poached him away from Pfizer. But then in the middle, there were a lot of things that were happening. And by August last year, we got fully acquired by Genentech, which is fully owned by Roche. And we became we kind of made up the name as well, the Genentech Accelerator. And our mandate from Genentech was to work on building the next generation platform to enable what we call de novo antibody design. So what we want is that we don't want to be able to find antibodies that already exist in the nature that are going to serve our purpose. Instead, we want to truly design a new antibody that does not exist in the nature, nor that can be produced by nature. And already by now, we have actually gone through multiple rounds of design, synthesis, and test. So we're working very closely with the antibody engineering department at Genentech. And what we see is that the machine learning does have a very high level of promise in this area. So I'm going to spend today mostly talking about some of the foundations on top of which we have built our technology for protein design. And first pillar behind, let's say, our deep manifold sampler is generative modeling. The one thing that everyone has been asking themselves about generative modeling is, what is it good for? Right? So why are we doing unsupervised learning? Why are we doing generative modeling? And it kind of makes sense in a sense that if you look at what generative modeling is, it's really all about learning the structure from the unlabeled data. When in our mind, the biggest success stories of deep learning have always been about supervised learning, where we're trying to figure out what are the associated labels of a new example based on the annotated examples. But then let's talk about why generative modeling is important, and it turned out that it's extremely important in the field of drug discovery, or more specifically molecular design. So when it comes to generative modeling, there are two very tightly related but are not equivalent goals. First one is scoring. So we want to learn an energy function that's going to assign an energy to any given example x, such that the energy is going to be lower if that x is very similar to one of those unlabeled examples that we use to train this generative model. Second goal is sampling. We should be able to draw samples from the distribution over this input space, such that the samples that we draw do look similar to the examples that we have in the training set. They are related in a sense that we can always turn the energy function into the distribution using the Boltzmann or the Gibbs-Boltzmann formula. So we simply exponentiate it so that the energy is going to be always non-negative, and we normalize it so that all these values are going to sum to 1. So that's how we make a distribution out of it. Of course, this does not necessarily imply that we can readily sample from this distribution. So we can always, in our mind, turn the energy function into a distribution, but that doesn't really mean that we can use the distribution readily. Anyway, thinking about this whole thing, what you notice is that the generative modeling is really nothing but training a neural network that's going to output a scalar value. So given any input, this neural net is going to compute a scalar value, and then the entire, let's say, entirety of the generative modeling is to train this neural network. Now, how do we train this? We often maximize the look likelihood of data D. So let's see how it looks like. So when we say we're going to maximize the look likelihood of data or the look likelihood of the parameters, depending on whether you're Bayesian or frequentist, it either works. The idea is that we are going to assume that all the data points that we have in this unlabeled data set were drawn from some underlying distribution. Identical underlying distribution, and each and every one of them was drawn independently from each other. Then the goal here is to try to maximize the look probability assigned to each and every training examples by our model, and we try to maximize the average of that. And doing so, following the Boltzmann-Gibbs formalism we just talked about, we end up with this, let's say, equation, which looks kind of, let's say, complicated, but what we realize is that there are just two terms for every example that we get. And then the first term is all about trying to ensure that we assign as low an energy as possible to the observations, so the actual training examples. And the other term is saying that we need to, at the same time, increase the energy values assigned to all possible input values. So we're playing a game here, essentially. So we need to ensure that all the training examples are going to receive a high probability. But how we do that is by ensuring that all the non-training example points are going to receive a very low probability. And if we compute the stochastic gradient, or we're trying to derive the stochastic gradient, what ends up happening is that we have, again, two terms. The first term is all about trying to decrease or change the parameters so that the energy assigned to the training example goes down, while the second term tries to increase the energy value assigned to the x prime, an example that is highly probable under the current configuration of the model. Because if any of those input point is already improbable according to our model, we don't really care. We only try to figure out what are the very likely points in the input space according to our model, and then we ask our model that, okay, that point should not be probable. And these two terms correspond to what we call positive phase and negative phase. And some of you who have been working in deep learning ever since, let's say, 2005 or so, these two terms are extremely familiar, because that's what we've been all working on. They're trying to train restrictive Boltzmann machines for the layer-wise pre-training, denoising autoencoder for the layer-wise training, all those things. Now, no one does it, but it turned out that these are still a very important concepts. So I'm going to skip through a bit. This is a drawing from my dissertation, PhD dissertation. It turned out it's actually quite useful. But then the idea is to essentially try to figure out what are the points that are highly probable under our model. So we often call them fantasy particles. And then trying to ensure that those points are going to be less likely, while all the probability mass move toward the training examples that are marked as black dots here. So when does training finish? Training finishes when the energy values assigned to the training examples are very low, but energy values assigned to all the other input points are very high. An interesting thing is, once we have this energy function, we can now think about it as characterizing or capturing what we call data manifold. So any point in the space, or any group of the points in the space that receive a high enough or the low enough energy values, we can say that, okay, that set corresponds to the manifold or the low dimensional manifold over which the realistic looking examples lie. And the whole point of machine learning, in fact, and whole, let's say, motivation behind machine learning is to identify such manifold so that we can work with finite number of examples in a high dimensional space. And this energy function that we can get if we could train this model is going to tell us which point belongs to the manifold and which other points are off manifold. So then you have to, well, let's talk about sampling a bit, because at the end of the day, one of the two major goals of generative modeling was to sample from this distribution that has been captured by our model. So what can we do? There are so many different ways to go about. First kind of, let's say, obvious approach that everyone tries is Gibbs sampling, where we try to sample one dimension at a time while fixing all the other dimensions, and then we repeatedly doing so. And in principle, it's always going to allow us to generate samples exactly according to the distribution, although it really never tells us how long we need to sample. Often the answer is almost infinitely long. And second thing, we can be slightly better if we have some sense of what we call a local distribution. If we know some sense of what are the perturbations that are allowed given any point in the space, then we can use the Metropolis Hastings with the acceptance probability that is written like this, although that's not really important unless we want to prove some of the convergence property of the Metropolis Hastings. Now, if the input space was continuous, that i.e. Simple, then we can use the Langevin dynamics or use the information coming out of computing the second order, first order, second order derivatives. This is great, except that most of the interesting data turned out to be not really continuous, and energy function is not going to be differentiable with respect to the input. Now, the fourth approach that was really, really popular until about 2 years ago, I don't know where all those papers on GANs actually went away to, but anyway, we can actually train this kind of generative adversarial network so that we can learn to sample from this kind of energy function directly. It's not really easy to train this model, but sometimes we can. So unfortunate thing is that none of these approaches works well when the input space, so the X, is discrete and combinatorial. Like literally, I can tell you that none of those approaches will work for you if you're into this kind of problem. And then unfortunately, this is the problem that we run into in natural language generation, drug discovery, molecular design, and anything where we have a small atomic units that we need to compose in order to get one input variable. So those can be atoms, like literally atoms, or the items, or the symbols, or whatnot. And the unfortunate thing is, if we cannot sample, we cannot train these generative models. It's just literally impossible, because the gradient that we want to use in order to train these generative models does involve the second term, the negative phase, that requires us to be able to draw samples from this distribution that has been defined by our model at that moment. And if we can't sample from it, then we cannot learn. If we cannot learn, we cannot sample. So not really in a great position. Anyway, and that's what we were trying to solve between 2006 and 2012. Like literally every single deep learning paper back then, there weren't too many. There were about, let's say, 12 a year. So it was much easier to read every single one of them. Every single one of them was trying to solve this issue of not being able to compute this second term in this gradient. So already in 2002, Jeff Hinton proposed that, okay, we can't really compute this exactly. Let's use the idea of the contrastive divergence. But then that one was not that great. So Jeff Hinton and others were started to propose various, let's say, variants of the contrastive divergence. And at the same time, I also was working on this problem, and we tried to go for what we call parallel tempering. So can we do better Metropolis Hastings by building multiple models that are going to be run in parallel, however, with the different, let's say, temperatures. And there are so many others. And in fact, this is an ongoing scientific endeavor. Although we don't really train a model using exactly this stochastic gradient formula, but at the end of the day, all these the more recently popular approaches, such as the diffusion-based models, flow-based models, and generative adversarial networks, they all end up solving the exactly same problem. They all look, they look different, but at the core, the idea is same. Anything that we generate or the sample from a model has to be the one that looks like the training examples, and anything that cannot be generated from the model has to look very, very different from training examples. So all these approaches are solving exactly the same problem. So sometimes we do better, but most of the times it's kind of impossible to do well. So why is it impossible? The manifold assumption states that the high dimensional data lie in a low dimensional manifold, and that's a great news. This is the reason why machine learning works. If this assumption doesn't hold, machine learning cannot work. Literally, machine learning cannot work. And what generative modeling does is to ensure that the energy function is going to be learned so that the values, energy values that are assigned to all these, to this low dimensional manifold are really, really low. So that's great, except that that also says that the energy values assigned off manifold have to be really, really high. Now, why is it really difficult is that the first one is great because we just need to look at the low dimensional manifold. But the second term is the problematic part. What it says is that we have to take into account this high dimensional off manifold space. Because we said that the data manifold is low dimensional. That means that the off manifold space has to be high dimensional. It's a conundrum. And in particular in a high dimensional space, second thing we really cannot do. It's not even clear whether that's really possible with the finite number of parameters that we have when the space is so large. So what Jeff Hinton said in 2002 with the, when he proposed the contrastive divergence was to say, to ask question, what if we only focus near data? Do we actually have to care about the entire space? Let's imagine that we want to build a generative model of images, natural images. Even without looking at the training data, we can tell very easily some of the images are not going to look anything like natural image. So what do we want one such example? Let's say we're going to draw a pixel intensity from some uniform distribution over the RGB space. And we're going to do that in the, one pixel at a time, independent of all the other pixels. You will never get the actual natural image. So we know that the most of the space is pretty useless. And only space that actually matters is something that looks like training examples and something that looks like training examples but not quite. So that distinction is what matters. And contrastive divergence is a way to ensure that our learning or the generative model focuses on the nearby neighborhood only. Because I'm getting lazier every week, so I kind of, let's say, stop drawing a nice looking figures and just use a tablet. So the idea is that let's say these are my training examples, and then these training examples are lying on a low dimensional, here let's say one dimensional curve. And now the idea, if we just train a generative model as they should be, then what we need to do is to ensure that all these, let's say, red colored, let's say, modes of the distribution are suppressed. But the thing is, that's too difficult to figure out all those modes in this large space. So what contrastive divergence says is that what if we start from each and every training example, explore a very small neighborhood surrounding it, and then only those, let's say, highly probable modes of the distribution in this neighborhood, we're going to suppress them. So we don't really care about all these modes that are very, very far away from where training data lies. Now, the advantage of this approach is that now suddenly we can solve this problem. We know that we can train a model to just focus on this narrow, let's say, corridor that covers the data manifold. But unfortunately, disadvantage is that after training, and if we start drawing sample from this model, and if we draw the sample long enough, then we're going to end up having samples from all those, let's say, far away spurious modes. But, let's say that we just don't run the sampling procedure too long. We're going to just run it short enough. And thinking about this, let's say, whole procedure of the contrastive divergence reminds us that if we could start sampling from any one of these training examples or any point on the data manifold, all we need to do is denoising to sample from the manifold. What do I mean by that? Let's say we're going to start from some point on this data manifold, and I'm going to try to figure out what is the direction toward which I can perturb my point without kicking it off the manifold. And all I need to do is just iteratively introduce the kind of stochastic perturbation that always ensures that our next point is going to be on the data manifold. And all we need to do is run it long enough and then collect them. And then that collection is going to be a set of well-looking or the well-formed samples from the data manifold. And where is the denoising? Denoising comes in from these two questions. There is what are those valid directions? And how do we sample from such valid directions? And denoising actually answers both of these questions. The first question, what are the valid directions? We can learn this valid direction by trying out all possible directions. So we're going to try out all possible directions of corruption or the perturbation. And then we train a neural net to suppress the corruption as much as it can. Now, the interesting thing is that if the direction of perturbation was off manifold, then this neural net will be able to reconstruct the original version. On the other hand, if the corruption or the perturbation was along the manifold, because of the ambiguity arising from other training examples on the manifold, this denoising autoencoder or the neural net won't be able to reconstruct back the original version because it can always go to another example and still that's going to be perfectly fine. And then this procedure, this denoising, which sounds kind of, let's say, pretty naive, turned out to be very well-principled approach to capture the data manifold. Let's look at one example now. This one is also from my PhD dissertation. I knew that this figure would be useful at some point. So the idea is that we have all these training examples, and this is a one-dimensional, let's say, curved, let's say, manifold here. Now, let's look at this particular example. Now, there are two different perturbations that I'm showing here. One is this red-colored one, and then the other one is the purple-colored one. Now, we want to train a neural net that's going to project or they reconstruct the original version from one of these perturbed versions. Now, if the change or the perturbation was off manifold, then this neural net will be able to reconstruct the original version perfectly because there's no ambiguity. However, if the perturbation was along the manifold, and say we ended up with this purple-colored one, because of another training example that is on the data manifold, there's no way this neural net can in fact reconstruct back the original version because there will be another example that's going to tell the neural net that this purple needs to be reconstructed back into that another example. And then this is how this denoising is a procedure by which we can learn how to change or how to introduce a perturbation in the input or the input point without moving away from manifold. And then we end up with this kind of, let's say, procedure of, sorry about that, surfing. So then we start from one training example. We're going to add the perturbation, and we're going to ask the neural net to put it back onto the manifold. And then we continue to do so. And then we collect all those examples that are going to be on the manifold. Now, there are a few important properties. The very first property is that this corruption procedure that we're going to use, or the perturbation procedure we use in order to train this denoising autoencoder, must be unstructured. As in, it has to be designed so as to check every possible perturbation you can imagine. And this is very different from data augmentation, because data augmentation is where you want to introduce a perturbation so as to preserve the property of the example as well as you can. So in fact, the data augmentation requires you to know about the directions that are going to preserve or they preserve the example to be on the manifold. On the other hand, when we try to learn where the manifold is, we have to introduce a perturbation that is as unstructured or as noisy as possible. And then the second important property is that we have to always start sampling procedure from the point that is near the data manifold. So this is one major restriction of this approach. The reason is, as we move further and further away from the data manifold, there will always be an ambiguity by which this denoising autoencoder or the denoising network cannot decide to which point in the manifold it needs to project back to, meaning that we will find all those spurious, let's say, modes when we move sufficiently far away from the manifold. And this one really cannot be resolved because in order to resolve this, what do we need to do? We need to actually train the generative model fully, trying to ensure that none of these spurious modes appear in the entire space. But the whole idea of using denoising autoencoder or contrastive divergence was to avoid doing so. The third thing is that although it looks like this corruption procedure is local, so we may think that all the sampling procedure might be too local and won't really change or explore the space enough, but because we use this high dimensional continuous latent space in building this kind of autoencoder or the denoising autoencoder, these models are going to actually make a huge jumps in the original input space. And I'm going to show you some examples of how it does it. So what does that mean is that we're going to just train the denoising autoencoder as a major foundation on top of which we build the antibody design platform. And it turned out this is one of the most effective way that we have learned so far. There are so many papers that talk about, let's use a variation autoencoder, let's use, I don't know, some kind of diffusion model, score-based model, and so on. None of them in practice works. But the denoising autoencoder, we know how to train it, and it actually does give us all those designs that we could express, and then we could see that those designs actually do bind to the target, let's say, antigens that we are interested in. So this is going to be one foundation. And second foundation is, of course, discriminative modeling. At the end of the day, what is the biggest weakness of generative model is that it really doesn't tell us anything about what those points are. We know that all those points that we sample from this model look really, really good. They are well formed, but we cannot really guide the whole process of sampling because these models are very agnostic to the actual properties of these generated designs or the points in the input space. So we have to rely a bit on classification and regression. And discriminative modeling is where deep learning has been shining most during the past decade or so. And it's actually being used very actively in molecular design already. So this is one kind of, let's say, the most simplified picture of how we do drug discovery in the small molecule space, the pills that you take. People start from, let's say, the set of libraries, which consists of, let's say, 10 to the power of 8, 9, 12 or so of possible candidates. And then starting from there, we do a lot of, let's say, screening. And one of the things that the neural net is allowing us to do is to do the screening better so that we can find the correct candidate. Of course, from the point at which we identify this lead candidate using neural net, and in particular the discriminative modeling, it's still going to take about 8 to 15 years for that pill to come to the market, but still, we can increase the success rate, and we can also dramatically reduce the time at which we need to do time for screening, because otherwise we have to make the experimental assay, and even with all those high throughput, let's say, experimentation, it takes like forever every time we run experiments. And that is also used in the protein modeling as well, and we use some of these techniques, although this paper from last year, actually, 2019, but that was the original, the very initial version, did not work that well, to be honest, yes. So the one interesting thing is that is this kind of, let's say, view of generative modeling or learning energy function is really nice because we can still look at the classifiers as energy functions as well, and then use the exactly same framework there. So let's say I train some classifier that's going to categorize any given input into one of the, finite number of categories. Then interesting thing is, given any target category, this classifier already implements the energy function for us. So any example that looks similar or that looks likely to belong to this particular target class is going to be assigned a high value by our classifier. We just negate it, and then we get an energy function for the particular class. Now, but this regularization is an issue because it turned out that regularization is key or the critical component. But before talking about the regularization, let's see here if this does give us anything that is sensible to start with. In 2014, after this, the AlexNet's, let's say, AlexNet shock or the revolution in computer vision, Karen Simonia, I don't know, I'm just blanking out on how to actually pronounce his last name, but let's say Karen, yes. So Karen decided to look into how to visualize what is going on inside this neural network. And the one thing he did was to interpret this logit value or the low probability assigned to a particular target as an energy function, and then trying to find the point in the input space that maximizes this logit value with a bit of regularization. And then these were the figures from his paper directly. And then what you see is that the kind of makes sense, like the bell pepper, you see a bit of bell pepper there. Lemon, you see a bit of a lemon. Washing machines, all those, let's say, tumblers there and so on, right? But of course, they do not look at all like any kind of images. Now, it turned out that you can do exactly same, you can use exactly same classifier, but if you have a slightly better, let's say, regularizer on what is the reasonable thing in the input space, you get something better. So, for instance, here, bananas, you see bananas there, right? looks much more bananas than all those, let's say, bell peppers and others from a year before. And then parachute, we see the parachutes there. Screws, we see all those screws there. It was really exciting because it was actually this kind of approach started to reveal the weakness of these deep learning classifiers as well. For instance, looking at the parachute, in order to detect whether parachute is there or not, all it needs to do is to look at parachutes, and it just has to look at the parachute. But this classifier always looks at a person. It looks at a person and then says, well, okay, so the person is in the middle in the air. Likely there is a parachute with that person. So it was actually revealing a lot of things, but let's not get to that one. But what we saw was that these classifiers or the discriminative models are still a viable way for us to build a generative model as well. Now, how is a classifier actually doing this? That's because any powerful classifier we build has to memorize training examples to a certain degree. Let's consider the k-nearest neighbor classifier, which is in fact the base optimal classifier, and then this is the optimal thing we can do if you know the perfect metric on the input space. Then the k-nearest neighbor classifier is by definition a classifier that memorizes every single training example, and k-nearest neighbor classifier, especially if the k is set to 1, can model any kind of, let's say, classification problem. Not that it's going to generalize well, but still it can do so. And then in fact it turned out, thinking about it from this angle, kernel machines, of course, they memorize all the training examples. Now we can always sparsify it, still it's going to memorize a lot of the training examples. And neural networks are also memorizing a lot of training examples, except that it learns what kind of examples needs to be memorized and what is the notion of the proximity in this input space. So it looks like the classifier should be enough, but why is it that we couldn't really get all those amazing images that look like, why were we getting all those unamazing images that did not look at all like the training images? That's because the classifier alone is not enough. So classifiers are going to tell us what are the reasonable looking images near the decision boundary. But anything that is slightly farther away from the decision boundary, this classifier's behavior is somewhat, let's say, chaotic and arbitrary. We really don't know what's going to happen slightly off the decision boundary when it comes to these classifiers, because there was no constraint outside the training set, nor between training examples. And this is one of my favorite figures from the Jason Yosinski's paper. So we can imagine that it's a very large input space, and then these are the decision boundaries, and these are the training examples on the top. And then training examples are the ones they marked as recognizable or the well-formed. But then the space is so large, as we talked about earlier, this is just a very low dimensional manifold in a high dimensional space. And these decision boundaries are going to be defined over the entire space. So what happens is that if we start using these decision boundaries as a way to define the energy landscape on the input space, we will inevitably sample off manifold. And then those are sometimes called adversarial examples, sometimes they are called, I don't know, like the AI art or whatever we want to call it. But you see that the issue is that the decision boundaries are not constrained on the data manifold alone. So what we need is we need a way to stay near the data manifold while using the discriminative model on top of that. So I'll pass on the naive approach because that's too naive. And already in 2017, An and Nguyen showed that we can actually we should use a discriminative model together with a generative model to define an energy function from which we can now sample in a controlled manner. So we want to sample from this generative model. However, we want it to be guided using this discriminative model where the guidance comes from the choice or the selection of the target class. And how he did it was to define this energy function or the distribution as the product of these two distributions. And once you have the product of two distributions, and if x is continuous, and your energy function and classifiers are differentiable with respect to the input, we can now use the idea of the longitudinal dynamic sampling. That is, use the gradient of these two terms and mix them with some, let's say, weighting coefficients in order to sample from this model iteratively. And these figures were actually amazing. I think that this paper may have been the reason why everyone started to think about how to generate a realistic looking images. like the photorealistic. And then compared to those two earlier papers from year before and then 2 years before, these just look so much better. And then the only change that An had to come up with was to ensure that the samples he drove from this classifier are constrained to be on the data manifold by using a generative model. And that generative model was the denoising autoencoder that he used. So only if we can make it work for the discrete X, then the problem is kind of solved. We know how to control our generation, and the generation or the generated samples are going to be on the data manifold automatically. And that's where our deep manifold sampler comes in. So we have a short workshop paper on this from 2 years ago. We had this actually largely done 3 years ago, except that the pandemic started, everyone was kind of going crazy, and the university was about to be shut down. Especially in New York City, the restaurants were shut down, everything was shut down, so we didn't really have time to write anything down. We just decided to just let's go outside the city, enjoy the nature subtly and so on. But anyway, so we wrote something down. You can take a look at it on bioRxiv. There are 3 desideratas that we had to really take into account from the very beginning. First thing is that the sampling has to be iterative. We cannot expect a sampler or the generative model or the design algorithm that we come up with to give us a one best design. That's impossible. The reason why it's impossible is that first of all, we have to have a lot of external oracles, including the human experts, to be able to intervene in the process of sampling. But if it's just one-shot sampling, that doesn't work like that. And then second thing is that we need a degree of, we need to be able to control the degree of exploration. And doing so, iterative approach is actually one of the best approaches go about. Now, the one thing that I did not put here is that perhaps even more important is that the real biology does not live inside computers. Real biology lives in the farms where our rabbits are being raised and killed as well. And the real biology lives in our body, but it's not really in computers. We can't really trust the computers fully to model the real biology. It's just way too complicated at the moment. And second thing is that the length must evolve during sampling. This sounds kind of, obvious to a lot of people who have worked on, natural language generation or the speech generation and so on, because speech or the language, of course, length has to evolve. Length has to change from one example to another. I mean, that's almost obvious. However, in biology as well as chemistry, this is not that obvious. It's not really easy for us to imagine what is the right way to remove things or to add things in without breaking the entire thing. It's very difficult. Of course, it was kind of obvious for me, so you were like, oh yeah, we can actually code it up very easily. So we incorporated this. And then the third thing is that the diversity must be prioritized. It's not really about maximizing certain property, because no property can be predicted perfectly when real biology is involved. So one example is the toxicity. So toxicity of any molecule that we design, we really have no idea how to predict its toxicity in humans. So that is a reason why we do a lot of, in vitro, experiments to check the toxicity. But we have to work with the animals as well. And then even then, because we don't know exactly whether this particular molecule is going to be toxic to people, that's why we have the multiple phases of clinical trial. And then large portion of the clinical trials are designed to check the toxicity, because that's the one thing that we don't know how to predict in advance. So what that means is that we can't really just build a platform that's going to give us, here's a one molecule that's going to cure a disease. It doesn't work like that. It has to be a lot of the candidates that we generate that are of course, high quality, but can be tested so that a small subset is going to eventually become actual drugs. So with this in mind, we can actually put things together. It's actually very easy to do so once we have all the desiderata as well as the foundations. First, we use a sequence denoising autoencoder that a lot of us, including myself, had worked on in 2014, 15, and so on. So we use the attention. We use a multi-vector representation. We introduce the length transformation coming out of the non-neutral regressive machine translation. And also we do the non-neutral regressive decoding just because that actually does maximize or let us control the diversity as well as exploration much better. And this denoising autoencoder is going to replace this part. the part where we need to compute the gradient of the generative model with respect to the input. Now, what do we mean by replacing this? It turned out the sampling from this denoising autoencoder is equivalent, under number of assumptions, equivalent to adding the gradient or the score to the input example at that point. So it turned out to be, in fact, a very nice way to avoid computing the gradient is to train a denoising autoencoder and sample from it instead. So that's what we are going to use. Well, this one actually, the residual level control, that's quite important. We have the paper at this, actually tomorrow at a workshop at iClear about drug discovery. And then if you are interested in this, let me know, I'll send you the link. And second ingredient is a function prediction. So we need to do the discriminative model, but of course, this doesn't exist because X is not really continuous values. So what we do is, so one way to go about is to simply use a Metropolis Hastings and using this denoising autoencoder as the proposal distribution and using this discriminative model as the energy function and use the acceptance rate that is that can be computed according to this equation on the slide. Not really great. Why is it not great? Because any kind of local sampling that's going to rely on the Metropolis Hastings inevitably fails due to either too low an acceptance rate or too high an acceptance rate without any change. So there's not going to be any mixing. And this, you can imagine it as, because we don't know how to compute the gradient, that is the steepest descent or the ascent direction, we're going to just try all those directions every time and then see which one is actually close to increasing the log probability by the classifier. It just looks pretty dumb. So whenever some people tell you that we have this approach that is going to just randomly try a lot of things and then pick the better one, then you can always assume that you will be able to solve the problem better. It's guaranteed, right? So what we do is to plug in this classifier on top of denoising autoencoder by using the representation that comes out of the encoding part of the autoencoder. And then because this internal representation of the denoising autoencoder is continuous, we can now compute the gradient of this, let's say, discriminator with respect to the input. And we can now alter this hidden representation just a little. So you can think of it as essentially kicking this denoising autoencoder toward the direction that we want it to go, or the discriminator tells us to go. And we sample from the decoder after the small, let's say, kick in the hidden representation. And this is what we do. This is what we do. I'm getting really, really lazy. So let's say, we're going to start with some, let's say, protein. And protein can be thought of as a string that consists of the letters that come out of, let's say, 20 letter vocabulary, in fact, 22 letter vocabulary. And we're going to introduce some random corruption. The corruption might remove some of the residues or the letters, may introduce some of the letters, may replace some of the letters. So the length changes. Now, this input sequence, corrupted version, goes into a transformer encoder. And then in the middle, we're going to have a length change predictor. So what was the length of the original sequence? Or we look at the delta, the difference. And then we use some kind of, let's say, either up-down scaling or another transformer in order to transform the length of the entire, the number of the vectors that we get. And then these vectors are going to go into this function predictor that's going to predict the functions that are associated with these proteins. And what we do is, after training is done, we can now use the gradient computed on the loss coming out of the function predictor in order to slightly alter what happens to the internal representation before the internal representation goes into transformer decoder that decodes out the new set of new sequence. And when we train it, we're trying to minimize the loss between the whatever comes out of this transformer decoder against the original clean version of the protein sequence. I'll show you some of the examples. So we trained this denoising autoencoder using the 20 million unlabeled sequences from the protein sequence database called PFAM. And we trained the protein function predictor on top of this denoising autoencoder using about 500,000 annotated sequences coming out of the UniProt. And as you can see, we just use all those random, let's say, corruption functions that you can imagine. Just remove some, add some, you have to replace some of them, mask out some of them, and whatnot. So the first thing we check is that if we start from the manifold, does manifold sampler actually stay on the manifold? And then what we did was we started from some known protein. So this is wild type protein that has certain energy level that we can compute computationally. You know, it's pretty approximate, but the absolute value doesn't matter, but the relative value actually does. And what we do is that starting from there, we started to just sample. We started to sample from this trained denoising autoencoder without any guidance. What we see is that these are all those, let's say, mutations, a number of the mutations that were introduced by our denoising autoencoder automatically. And then what we see is that the energy level never stays above the wild type's energy model. So if the energy value starts creeping up, that means that we are jumping off the manifold little by little. But what we see is that the energy level is almost always constant within some band. That is a good sign that this denoising autoencoder is indeed staying on the manifold. So that was a good, let's say, signal. So we decided to try some of these designs. So what we did was we started with this known calcium ion binder. So this is a meta binder. So what you see is that this is a protein, and then this is the pocket where the calcium ion is going to be bound. And this one is a very well-known protein, and then we know exactly what are the letters that correspond to this pocket. So what we did was we just removed them. We just literally removed them. And this is the initial sequence. And one thing I can tell you is that this initial sequence is not going to fold, it's not going to be functional, it's not going to be a good protein to start with. And what we do is that we're going to run this procedure of iterative generation while conditioning on the calcium ion binding function. So we tell the function predictor to compute the gradient of the log probability assigned to the calcium ion binding with respect to the internal representation of the denoising autoencoder, and then we add that little by little every time we go through each generation. And what we see is that within 6 generations, those residues that we forcefully removed were reintroduced. And then when we use a TR Rosetta, this is kind of, let's say, the grandfather of the AlphaFold 2, you can imagine it like that. What we see is that this one actually folds very well and does introduce this pocket, that calcium pocket with which the calcium ion bind. And we got really excited about this result, so we were like, can we then also strengthen a function? So we started with this protein. Again, this is a known protein that has a cutinase activity. And then what we wanted was that can we actually design a variance of this protein that are going to maximize this particular activity or the function that we wanted to maximize. And interesting thing is we already know, because this protein has been studied quite a bit, some of the residues that are really important for this particular activity. And obviously, we did not give our model that these residues are important. The model wasn't actually told about it. All we did was, starting from here, let's do the sampling, but let's try to maximize the log probability assigned to cutinase activity. And these are some of the samples that we generated from this procedure. They all look different. The size differs, like the length differs, and then what kind of, let's say, residues are there. They all differ. But one thing for sure is that every sample, in fact, preserves these important residues, starting from there. And this was also very exciting because we never actually told our model that these residues are really, really important. This model, the generative model, combined with the discriminative model, were able to identify these important residues on its own, because what does it do? It tries to stay on the manifold, and at the same time trying to maximize this function itself. So it just did it automatically. And we got really adventurous. We were trying all those crazy stuffs, and this is one of those crazy examples that are not realistic at all, but just showing off what kind of things can be done, and in particular, how well this denoising autoencoder can explore the space globally. It's not really local at all. So we started with this protein that is from the PDB protein database. And then this protein consists mostly of the beta sheets. And we know that most of these kind of, let's say, transmembrane transporter proteins, so the protein that is kind of stuck in the membrane of the cell, they have to have all these alpha helix structures, secondary structures. But where we started did not have any of those. So we were like, can our model actually design a transmembrane transporter even when we start from a point in the manifold that has nothing to do with transmembrane transporter activity? And then we just ran it within about 6 generations. We got to this protein, which does have all those secondary structures that are alpha helix rather than the beta sheets. So this was also cool. This actually tells us that the exploration by denoising autoencoder is actually very, very global, not local. So what we actually learned over the past, let's say, 2-3 years or so is that we can't really focus on either of these alone. If we only focus on generative model, we always end up with the models that are useless. If we only focus on the discriminative models, then we end up with the models that are very useful, but for a very narrow set of problems. To solve a broader set of problems that require us to generate not just a label information or the class information, but the entire, let's say, drug or the entire molecule or entire material, we have to look at both of these paradigms always together. And what they do, or what each of these does, is generative modeling narrows down the search space very intelligently, and the discriminative modeling is going to guide the whole sampling procedure within this narrowed down search space. And what I showed you are the examples of how that is actually being done very, very effectively as well as efficiently. And all the examples that I showed you were all computational, but we have we now know that we can actually synthesize them, and then we know that those things actually do fold. They do whatever we want them to do. Not as well as I want them to, but still, one step there. So what are some of the next steps that we need to think about once we started combining this generative model and the discriminative model for the purpose of design? We now need to go into the idea of building this, what we call lab-in-the-loop design platform. Because at the end of the day, real biology does not live inside our computers, but in the labs or the farms or whatnot, right? So two things that need to be really taken care of immediately. One is uncertainty quantification, because we really need to maximize the learning or the gain in the information, and also to gain the trust in our designs. And this trust is not the trust by the lab scientists, because they don't trust any of the designs anyway, but for us, ourselves. We have to be able to trust that the designs that we produce are the ones that are good. And to do so, we need to be able to quantify the uncertainty. We can't just simply say, oh, my algorithms really work well. And interesting challenge here is that trying to quantify the uncertainty of a classifier is so much less challenging than trying to quantify the uncertainty in the procedure of sampling. Because now at the moment, you can imagine this generative model as a classifier with the exponentially large, let's say, label space. And when that is the case, we are not even sure what is the right way to do any kind of calibration, because we'll never be able to cover the entire space. But that's a challenge, interesting challenge. And then the second one is a multi-objective sampling, because at the end of the day, we cannot maximize a single quantity. It's not about single quantity. We have to maximize about 12 to 24 different types of the properties, at least at the very early stage, in order to ensure that the success rate of the lead molecule is going to be high enough. And if you are familiar with the black box optimization, yes, multi-objective sampling, actually, the optimization works pretty well. But if you dig into it a bit, they are always working on, let's say, 2 to 5 dimensions only. And we're now talking about the thousands, if not tens of thousands of dimensions. And I don't think anybody actually knows how to do this efficiently and effectively. But to explore the trade-off between the exploration, well, there's a double exploration. But anyway, to investigate the trade-off between exploration and exploitation, we really need to be able to do this multi-objective sampling in a very high dimensional space. We have some ideas like using a gradient-based optimizer together with the black box optimizer, but it's unclear what is the right thing to do yet. So finally, what do we want to build is what we call lab-in-the-loop, let's say a design platform, where we have the generative model combined with the discriminative model that's going to guide the sampling. So we have the manifold sampler and the guided sampling that are aware of the uncertainty and also can work with the multiple objectives. And then the designs we get out of are going to go into the lab. And then the lab scientists are going to run the experiments. So they're going to synthesize them, run the experiments, and then measure all the properties that we could as quickly as possible, although that takes about 2 to 3 months. And then whatever we get from the lab are going to go back into our sampler as well as the discriminator model in order to produce the next set of, or the batch of the designs that are going to be better in all those different aspects. We're very far from it, but it looks like a very promising start at the moment. And that actually does conclude my talk, and thanks for listening, and great to be here, yes. Thanks.
Okay, any questions?
Yep.
With this lab in the loop concept, you mentioned toxicity in humans. Would that feedback be included somehow? Because there's a long lag with that.
Yeah, so not yet. So if you think about the drug discovery pipeline, we always start from science, where the science involves not only just trying to figure out what kind of molecules are going to be interesting for drugs, but starting from characterizing disease itself. Because the definitions of the disease tend to evolve over time, because our understanding of disease is not perfect. And given that definition of the disease, we always trying to find the pathways that are shared across multiple diseases. And then given those pathways, we try to figure out what kind of, let's say, targets are the things that we need to, let's say, tackle in order to break some of those the disease pathways. And from there, we go into the early discovery stage where this lab-in-the-loop platform will be useful. Here, everything is in vitro, or a bit of, let's say, animal as well, but they're mostly in vitro. And then we're going to find what we call lead molecule by that point. But once we have the lead molecule, we need to optimize that lead molecule for the various other, let's say, properties, what we call often developability properties. And that takes several years. And then after that, we go into the animal testing. And then after the animal testings are done, we can now apply for the investigative new drug, let's say, designation from the FDA. And then we go into the clinical trial and whatnot. So at the moment, this one is still only in a very early portion. However, the goal is indeed to expand the whole thing, so that we can now take into account the outcome from the animal testing, which is going to tell us a lot about the toxicity. And then, in fact, ultimately, we want to be able to predict the clinical outcomes, clinical trial outcomes, so that we can design the molecules to maximize the success rate, not at the lead molecule, let's say, selection stage, nor the animal testing, but at the stage of the clinical trial. That's what we want to do. Probably it's going to take some time, but gotta have some ambition, right? Yes. So the answer is not yet.
One more question.
Yes, please.
You mentioned this case where you removed, I think it was a calcium binding thing, and you saw that it kind of recreated the essential parts of the sequence. Did you have examples where it found an alternative, like a completely novel alternative with the same function?
Yeah, so that's a good question. So the difficult part about this kind of molecular design is that the de novo design is when we get a really new molecule that was designed out of these machine learning systems, we really can't tell whether those are going to be a good molecules, because they do not look at all like the existing, let's say, molecules coming out of the nature, kind of, let's say, naturally, right? That's the reason why it has to be lab in the loop with working together with a lab, because real biology and real chemistry can tell us, to a certain degree, they are very noisy still, tell us even a de novo design is useful or productive for us. So the answer is that yes, we've seen a lot of samples where our sampler was just designing things that do not look at all like whatever we get out of, let's say, natural, let's say, immune systems or whatnot, as in the case of the antibodies, but we can't really know whether those are really, really useful or not at the moment. Some of them are being actually synthesized and tested. One of the big issues is that this is uncertainty quantification, and also trying to detect whether those examples are out of distribution or not. Right? So if the de novo designs are by definition out of distributions, so many of these computational classifiers that we have are going to simply fail because they don't know what to do with this kind of de novo design. So that's also a challenging part of this kind of molecular design or the drug discovery process, is that we always have to ensure that we are going to make designs that are on the boundary between known and unknown. So there's a known part and unknown part. Our goal is to actually get the design out of these unknown parts, but we can't go too far because then we don't know how to even verify. So there's a known and unknown, and we have to make sure that we sample from this boundary. That is pretty narrow boundary. And by doing so, we kind of push the frontier of this known little by little in order to do the de novo design. So the answer is yes, we've seen a lot of, let's say, unconventional designs coming out of our system, but we can't really verify whether they are just whether they are bugs or features. Yes, not yet. But some of them are being synthesized. Some, there are some surprises that we find. Yes.
You say you have to verify the variations of molecules designed by the algorithm. And how long does it take to actually see the result? And
Right.
Is there a way to shorten that?
Yeah, so that's really a good question. So that's about this part. So building an experimental assay and running the experiments and then getting the feedback. It actually varies a lot on what kind of things you're doing. So for instance, we can shorten it all the way down to, let's say, a week or so if we decided to make a designs in a way that follows certain templates so that we can use the same assay over and over and make it so that we can essentially automate the whole, let's say, experiments using a robots and so on. So those are going to be what we call high throughput chemistry or the high throughput biology. But not everything can be made in that kind of high throughput way. So then some of the designs that we create tend to be pretty wild. So we gotta always essentially rerun the entire experiments from the beginning to the end. And then doing so, in our case, takes about 2 months at the moment. And then there is a lot of, let's say, discussion about how to speed it up. But the figuring out how to speed the experiments up is also a big kind of, let's say, research area, as well as where a lot of startups are actually focusing on. So some of the startups don't care about this portion. And then they think that, well, machine learning is going to advance eventually so that there will be tons of designs that are going to come their way. Now, what is the right way to dramatically speed up or to dramatically reduce the latency in experimental feedback? And like some companies, including, let's say, Lab Genius in London, they're not doing well these days. But anyway, what they wanted to do was really like automate the entire lab by using the like the robotics as well as the control theory and so on. Yes. So 2 months for us, 2 to 3 months. And then the supply chain crisis is killing us, yes. It often takes a bit longer, yes. Yep.
I have a question on the team dynamics. Because it seems like there are it's a very nice multidisciplinary work. And so all the members come from different departments. So I wonder how the dynamics work and how long did it take to work as a very strong team?
Yeah, so the precision design, we are almost exclusively computational in a sense that about a third of us are machine learning scientists, a third of us are the structural biologists or the structural chemists, and the rest are the software engineers, the data engineers and whatnot. Now, we have been mandated by the leadership of Roche to work together with the antibody engineering department. Now, they were also mandated to work with us so as to build this kind of next generation platform. Now, what that means is that sometimes the antibody engineers who have been looking at the antibodies for, let's say, past 3 decades or so, they feel that some of the designs that we produce are too wild. They want to ensure that the only things that are going to synthesize well and express well and also bind well, they want to just test only those things, right? So sometimes, we just have to push it through. So, we're going to have, let's say, 2-hour-long discussion, and at the end, I'm going to simply say that, well, but you all have to just test all these designs that we send, and I'm saying, I'm jumping off the call because I have another call or something like that. But generally, so precision design, we've been kind of, let's say, very much focused on making sure that we're not machine learning focused only. We're not biology focused only. So every time we hire one machine learning scientist, we're going to hire one, let's say, structural biologist. So we've been making that kind of, let's say, balance pretty well. And then that set us apart from many of those so-called drug discovery startups at the moment. Most of them are either just a team of only biologists, team of only chemists, or a team of only machine learning scientists. And none of them will be able to know what kind of challenges there are because they only see one side of it. But as you mentioned, this whole thing requires us to see the problem from many different aspects simultaneously. And what we need is the kind of a strong push from the leadership in order to go out of the status quo. And the status quo in, let's say, antibody design is what we call animal immunization campaign. So we're trying to give, let's say, virus to, let's say, rabbits, and then see if the rabbit's immune system can produce the antibodies that are going to be useful eventually. And that's actually quite successful, except for a few examples like the HIV and so on. These rabbits and rats and llamas, their immune systems are quite amazing. So we have to kind of, let's say, change the culture in which we can treat all these, let's say, machine learning driven systems to be treated even more so, or the better so, than those the animal immunization campaign, for instance. For that, there has to be a big push from the leadership, and that's the one thing that we really ensured when we went through all those acquisition processes, that for the next 4 years, we can always design and synthesize in experiments whatever we need to do. So 6 months in, so far so good, but we'll see. Next year I must say that, oh no, this is a big mistake. Oh, my laptop died. Perfect timing, I think.
There is one more.
Oh yes, please. Yeah.
Yeah, Sonu, you can ask question.
Oh, okay. Hi, nice to see you again, and thanks a lot for the really awesome talk. It was interesting to see a mix of, well, predominantly generation, but a bit of discrimination as well. And I find it pretty cool that you found a problem area that you can apply your knowledge a bit more directly to. And that's cool. But I want to ask a bit of a question from our perspective also. So for us, the main task is discrimination, essentially in most cases. Or perhaps we restrict ourselves and should be more imaginative. But for the time being, it's discrimination. And there is the entire area of learning by synthesis. And I think your talk doesn't exactly talk about learning by synthesis, as the learning part involves humans and experimentation too. But what are your thoughts on learning by synthesis for computer vision in discriminatory tasks such as segmentation or detection?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, the learning by synthesis is a fascinating, the concept, and also it's not really like the niche. In a sense, there's a whole field in statistics as well as the high energy physics and so on, that where we refer, where we call them simulation-based inference, or the likelihood-free inference, or proximate Bayesian computation. In those setups, what we have is that we have access to the generation pipeline, but we often don't have the analytical form that allows us to compute the probability. That's just like the learning by synthesis. So a lot of the techniques that were invented or created in along that line, like the likelihood-free inference, could be actually applied to this learning by synthesis concept. And I don't think there has been a lot of, let's say, mix between these two areas. But looking at them, they look exactly same to me. So I think that that's one direction that should be taken into account. And another way in which the generative models can be used is for the purpose of data augmentation. In fact, another talk that I gave last week at KAIST was about how to use these denoising autoencoders in order to perform, let's say, learned data augmentation or the trained data augmentation, and they can be quite useful. And then that's, I think, where all these things can come together as well. So we start from the classification only, but then we want to augment the data because we want to be able to say that our classifier is going to behave smoothly over the data manifold. Then we need to know about what data manifold is. So we have to train this kind of denoising autoencoder in order to characterize the data manifold and sample from this denoising autoencoder in order to augment the data. But then eventually what happens is that we will want to just generate and identify things that we like or dislike for the active learning type of thing. So lab in the loop says that essentially we want to find the things that we don't know, right? Anything that we know, we don't really care because we need to do the de novo design. So yeah, those things all come together. So you might want to check out some of the work on using the denoising autoencoder or the mask language model in order to produce all these data the perturbations that preserve the examples so that the classifiers are going to behave smoothly over the data manifold. I think my talk from last week is actually on YouTube, so it could be a useful, let's say, pointer. Yes. Yeah.
Thanks a lot for the answer.
All right. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much.